भगवते वासुदेवाय। नारायणं नमस्कृत्य नरं चैव नरोत्तमं देवीं सरस्वतीं व्यासं ततो जयमुदीरयेत्। नष्टप्रायेषु अभद्रेषु नित्यं भागवत सेवया भगवती उत्तमा श्लोके भक्तिर्भवति नैष्टिकी। Reading from Bhagavad Gita as it is, chapter 7, Knowledge of the Absolute, text number 27. Ichha dvesha samuthena, ichha dvesha samuthena, dvandva mohena bharata, dvandva mohena bharata, sarva bhutani sammoham, sarva bhutani sammoham, sarge yanti parantapa, sarge yanti parantapa, ichha dvesha samuthena, dvandva mohena bharata, sarva bhutani sammoham, sarge yanti parantapa, ichha dvesha samuthena, dvandva mohena bharata, sarva bhutani sammoham, sarge yanti parantapa, ichha dvesha samuthena, dvandva mohena bharata, sarva bhutani sammoham, sarge yanti parantapa.
इच्छा द्वेष समुत्वेना द्वन्द्वमोहेन भारत
सर्वभूतानि सम्मोहं सर्गे यान्ति परन्तप
इच्छा द्वेष समुत्थेन द्वन्द्वमोहेन भारत सर्वभूतानि सम्मोहं सर्गे यान्ति परन्तप
इच्छा द्वेष समुत्थेन द्वन्द्वमोहेन भारत सर्वभूतानि सम्मोहं सर्गे यान्ति परन्तप
इच्छा द्वेष समुत्थेन द्वन्द्वमोहेन भारत सर्वभूतानि सम्मोहं सर्गे यान्ति परन्तप
Icha, desire. Dvesha, hate. Samuthena, born. Dvandva, duality. Mohena, overcome. Bharata, O sign of Bharata. Sarva, all. Bhutani, living entities. Sammoham, into delusion. Sarge, in creation. Yanti, go. Parantapa, O conqueror of enemies. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada. Translation. O sign of Bharata, Arjuna, O conqueror of the foe, all living entities are born into delusion, overcome by the dualities of desire and hate. Translation with repetition. O sign of Bharata,
O sign of Bharata,
Arjuna,
Arjuna,
O conqueror of the foe,
O conqueror of the foe,
all living entities
all living entities
are born into delusion,
are born into delusion,
overcome
overcome
by the dualities of
by the dualities of
desire and hate.
desire and hate.
Purport by Srila Prabhupada. Jai Srila Prabhupada. The real constitutional position of the living entity is that of subordination to the Supreme Lord, who is pure knowledge. When one is deluded into separation from this pure knowledge, he becomes controlled by illusory energy and cannot understand the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The illusory energy is manifested in the duality of desire and hate. Due to desire and hate, the ignorant person wants to become one with the Supreme Lord and envies Krishna as the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Pure devotees who are not so deluded or contaminated by desire and hate can understand that Lord Sri Krishna appears by his internal potencies. But those who are deluded by duality and nescience think that the Supreme Personality of Godhead is created by material energies. This is their misfortune. Such deluded persons symptomatically dwell in dualities of dishonor and honor, misery and happiness, woman and man, good and bad, pleasure and pain, etc. Thinking, this is my wife, this is my house, I am the master of this house, I am the husband of this wife, these are the dualities of delusion. Those who are so deluded by dualities are completely foolish and therefore cannot understand the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Thus ends the Transcendental Bhaktivedanta purport. Om Ajnanatimirandasya Jnananjanashalakkhaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Presthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Niti Namine. Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna. So we are reading from chapter 7, Knowledge of the Absolute, and today we are reading verse number 27. So this is almost the end of this chapter, and there are another 3 more verses after this, and then the chapter will end. So just to briefly recap last verse, the description of Lord's omniscience, that Lord knows the past, present and the future, whereas the living entity is does not know the supremacy of the Supreme Lord, and therefore the living entity is actually in ignorance. So that is what was discussed in the last verse. That is the omniscience of the Supreme Lord and the living entity's ignorance. Now today's verse is furthermore explaining what is this cause of ignorance. Why is that the living entity is in ignorance? As some people propagate that the living entity is equal to the Supreme Lord, or at least theoretically can become equal to the Lord. And therefore, they say it's just there is some sort of covering, which is the illusory covering, which is preventing from the living entity from becoming the Supreme Lord. But as we saw in the last verse, how that is not true. Even in this verse, we can further see that the Lord is explaining there is a particular reason why the living entity comes into this state of ignorance and therefore falls down from the position of spiritual existence to material existence. So this verse is very popular and very important and significant, for this is explaining what is the cause for a living entity to fall down from the spiritual world to the material world. And Prabhupada quotes this verse in different places to explain the significance of this verse and how living entity is falling down into this material existence. So this verse states Ichha Dvesha Samuthena. So from the dualities of desire and hate, Dvandva Mohena, so from these two things, the dualities of desire and hate, when one is overcome by these two tendencies of desiring and hating, and we'll discuss more specifically what these two words mean, the living entities, in fact here it is said Sarva Bhutani, all the living entities. So they are born into a delusion. So this is a very interesting term, delusion. So the living entities, the word delusion, sammoham, so completely deluded. So as we were saying today, there is a perfect vision, and here we can see perfect delusion or into delusion. Now, what is delusion? So delusion, if one looks up for the word delusion, one can see that delusion means when one is mistaking something or having a certain belief that something is true, but actually that is not true. For example, one may think, I will get a nice promotion this year, but perhaps he is living in a delusion that it is not actually possible. So similarly, this is a very generic example of delusion, but here it is being said that all living entities are born into delusion. That means all living entities are carrying certain beliefs, certain conditioning that they come with, and that conditioning is resulting in some sort of hope or in some sort of knowledge or in some sort of understanding that something is actually true or something's actually going to happen. But actually, in reality, that does not take place. That does not happen. That is not what it is. And therefore, the living entities, when they're deluded, they mistake things. They misrepresent things, misunderstand things, and they act in a wrong way, in a way which is not in tune with reality. And therefore, delusion is cause of misery. Therefore, maybe we will look into some verses, if possible, that how there are different devotees of the Lord who all pray to the Lord, please help me remove this delusion, or please remove my delusion. Because unless one is not free from delusion, one actually cannot come to one's real state of existence. And therefore, this delusion is a constant theme that comes across different chapters. In different places, the word delusion is used, because a conditioned living entity by nature is deluded. And in fact, in the prayers of Devahuti, when she is offering prayers to or she is praying to Kardama Muni, please remove my delusion. Similarly, we see various devotees, even in Krishna book, or asking even demons asking when Nagapatnis or other, they are offering prayers, they are asking for this removal of this delusion. And now this delusion is coming to all living entities, and it is coming because of the living entities overcome by the dualities of Ichcha and Dvesha. Now this word Ichcha, Prabhupada is translating here as desire, and Prabhupada states that every living entity by nature has this intrinsic capability to desire. But some people think that by artificial means one can prevent desiring, but actually it is not possible. Every moment, every living entity has to desire something. But what kind of desire is that is bringing one into this material creation, material existence? The desire to lord over material nature. The desire to become one with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So that desire, which is separate from the Lord's desire. As we know, the living entity is free, has got this freedom to choose his own desires. And therefore, when the living entity desires such a desire to be separate from the Lord, or to lord over material nature, to enjoy independently, the Lord provides an opportunity for the living entity to experience such a kind of life. Similarly, Dvesha, Prabhupada says, the envy or the hate. When the living entity envies, oh, why should only Krishna enjoy this way? Why should Krishna be served by so many Lakshmi Devis? Why should Krishna be surrounded with so much opulence? I should also become like that, or I should have more. Why is Krishna enjoying? I want to enjoy independently. So when this hate, when this envy comes into the living entity's heart, that's when the living entity enters into this state of, is covered by ignorance or delusion. And therefore, this is the reason why, because one has got this Ichcha and Dvesha, which is asking the living entity to be separate from the Supreme Lord, and therefore the living entity is to be provided by the Lord's mercy, is provided with such an opportunity to experience this kind of desire, to enjoy this the independent desire that the living entity has got. And therefore the Lord creates this material creation. And material creation means that it is filled with material energy. That means that creates a state where the living entity forgets the Supreme Lord and one's own constitutional position. So this is a very important principle to understand, because it is by this process we come into this material world, and when we purify our Ichcha and Dvesha, we can also go back to the spiritual world. So as we will also see how one can overcome delusion and become determined in devotional service. That will be discussed in the next verse. Furthermore, as what is that is required for someone to come out of this delusion. Although we'll touch upon it briefly, but it is very important. These two terms, Ichcha and Dvesha, are very, very important. Now, it is very much important for us to understand where is this desire. Okay, somehow or the other we have come into this material world. Now, how are we developing our desires in the current moment of time? So, as we know, in various places in Bhagavad Gita, there is a lot of description about where are our desires coming from. And one source of desire is Manorathena. So as we see, Sri Bhagavan Uvacha, Prajahati yada kaman sarvan partha manogatan. So manogatan, Prabhupada translates as of mental concoction. So one kind of desires people develop because of mental concoction. And a person who is in transcendental consciousness, who is Sthita Prajna, is freed from this mental concoction or desires that are arising from mental concoction. So as we know, every living entity is always having desires. And it is very important for all of us to check our desires. And one source of those desires is coming from mental concoction. And unless one is not situated in transcendental consciousness, or one is not aligning one's desires in line with the instructions of the spiritual master and the scriptures, one is bound to have desires arising from mental concoction. And therefore one has to be very, very cautious when one is desiring to do, even in the name of devotional service. Sometimes we may want to do various things, but we need to know whether is this desire is something that is arising from my mental concoction, or is it actually a desire which I'm supposed to fulfill. And therefore it is very important. That's why we have authority system, because it is by this authority system that we can overcome our mental speculation, mental concoctions. Otherwise, the living entity by nature is prone to always concoct something out of one's own limited experience and assume something to be good. That's the meaning of the word delusion. The living entity is thinking, this is what I'm doing is actually the right thing, this is the reality. Whereas it could be actually very different from that. And therefore, making desires of the spiritual master, the authorities, as one's own desires is a safe position for a living entity, especially who wants to make advancement in spiritual life. This is a very important principle. The other, as we know, the other source of desire is dhyayato vishayan pumsaha sangasteshu pujayate sangat sanjayate kamaha kamat krodho abhijayate. So while contemplating the objects of senses, a person develops attachment for them. So basically, our desires, when we are contemplating upon certain material objects, we develop certain desire, in fact not just desire but an attachment. So too much contemplation on material things, material subject matters, material objects leads one to desire material things. And therefore one has to be also careful of these topics one is contemplating upon. What am I speaking? What am I thinking? What am I constantly endeavoring to be surrounded with? Because what we surround with naturally influences us to desire in a certain way. And therefore we always constantly hear that association is very important. Association of devotees is very important. Why association of devotees is important, and why association of non-devotees is to be restricted or to be avoided? Because it is in this association that one develops desires. So if one associates with pure devotees, then one develops pure desires. If one is associating with drunkards or some other people with material ambitions, we are also prone to develop certain desires which are in line with those desires that those people are having. And therefore the objects of senses, or what we are contemplating, is also another important principle that one need to keep in mind, because that is another source of desire. And the spiritual source of desire is when we read shastras, when we see the life of pure devotees, we can also develop certain desires. We can also hear the desires of the spiritual master. So when we become very, very attentive, when we become very sincere, and when we pray to the spiritual master, we can hear his innumerable desires, because the spiritual master is always desiring to satisfy Krishna, to serve him, to glorify him more and more, and also to take back the fallen souls to the spiritual world. And therefore the spiritual master has so many services, just like the Lord is unlimited, and his services are also unlimited, and a pure devotee is also unlimitedly engaging in the service of the Lord, and also he wants to engage his unlimited living entities in various services. Therefore when we become attentive to hear the desire of a pure devotee, then we can also develop those desires and serve those desires. Similarly, we should also become very attentive to hear the desires of the authorities. What are they actually thinking? What do they want? And when one aligns one's life in tune with those desires, then there is empowerment. The spiritual life means being empowered. Empowered means I'm not capable, but by the strength that is provided by someone else, I can do something. And how is that possible? When the desire is aligned. Because if the desire is not aligned, any activity that we are doing is in some way conflict with the real desire of the spiritual master or the authority. And therefore, one is not fully empowered. Just like we hear, Tara Icha Balavan, the desire of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was very strong. And that strong desire of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was a desire of Srila Prabhupada. And that desire was a desire of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So when in this parampara system one acquires desires, then one is actually having safe desire, one is having the right desire, a desire by which one can become closer and closer to the Lord. One can become far and far away from the delusion or the desires which are arising from concoction or sense gratificatory contemplation. So it is always very important for us to check our desires. And the desire to satisfy and please the Supreme Lord, His pure devotees and devotees of the devotees, if one is carrying this kind of desire, then one is very, very safe in spiritual life. One will not be overcome by the delusion, by false hate and false desires will not arise. So other aspect is envy and hate, and that is another aspect that naturally comes, that someone is doing better than me or someone is lower than me, so I start to look down upon someone, or if someone is better than me, I can become envious of him. So in order to overcome these external features of anarthas, it is very always important to contemplate upon, one has to introspect. So introspect to make advancement in one's own spiritual life and to be concerned about one's own spiritual progress. So because this material energy or Bahiranga Shakti means that our attention is always on the external things. We forget importance of introspecting our own progress, introspect on things that we need to do for our own spiritual advancement. And when we are not introspective, when we are not careful, we can be carried away in some other external forms of comparing or criticizing or looking down upon someone. So these things can also come. So one has to be, as we see, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu says, Namna Amakari Bahuda Nija Sarva Shaktis Tatra Pita Niyamita Smarane Nakalaha Etadrishi Tava Kripa Bhagavan Mamami Durdevam Idrisham Ihajani Nanu Ragaha. So Mahaprabhu is saying that all the potencies, the holy name is carrying all the potencies, but I have no taste, I have no attachment for the holy name. So if this is the concern of a devotee, that I should actually develop attachment for the holy name, I have so much work to do, I have so much to read, I have so much to look within, then so many of the external things will not bother us. But if that is not the concern, then we are always worried about external things. And external things means we are under the grip of the material nature. And as we will see now, what happens as we are in the grip of material energy is that we forget our real constitutional position. That is of subordination to the Supreme Lord, who is pure knowledge. So this is another very interesting translation, purport by Prabhupada, who is saying the Lord is being described here as pure knowledge. And that's exactly opposite to delusion. So one who is in delusion is not in pure knowledge. That is because one is in contact with material energy. Whereas as soon as one comes in contact with the Supreme Lord, who is pure energy, pure knowledge, one's delusion immediately vanquishes. In fact, in 13th chapter, nature, the enjoyer, and the consciousness, there is even furthermore description of how living entity comes into this material world. And there are some very nice verses and description. Maybe I'll just read few things from these purports. So in verse 21 of the chapter 13, it is said, Karya Karana Kartritve Hetu Prakritir Uchyate Purushaha Sukha Dukhanam Bhoktritve Hetu Uchyate. Nature is said to be the cause of all material activities and effects, whereas the living entity is the cause of the various sufferings and enjoyments in this world. So here it is being said that the nature is said to be the cause of all material activities and effects, whereas the living entity is the cause of the various sufferings and enjoyments in this world. So there is two causes that are being described here, the living entity and the nature. So sometimes people associate that the Lord is responsible for my suffering and my happiness, for He has put me in this specific body and therefore I am struggling. But actually it is being said here that although it is true that the material nature is providing a certain form of material body to the living entity, but actually that specific body that is being provided to the living entity is because of the living entity's desire. And therefore it is being said there are 84 lakhs different species of life, and these varieties are the creation of the material nature. So it is true that these different bodies that are being provided are actually provided by material nature. They arise from the different sensual pleasures of the living entity who thus desires to live in this body or that. So although the material nature is providing, why the material nature is providing? Because of one's desire to live in a specific body. When he is put into different bodies, he enjoys different kinds of happiness and distress. His material happiness and distress are due to his body and not to himself as he is. In his original state, there is no doubt of enjoyment. Therefore, that is his real state. So Prabhupada goes on to say that actually this different kinds of happiness and distress that the living entity is acquiring is because of the specific body that one is acquiring. And why is that one is acquiring that specific body? Because one is desiring to lord over the material nature in a specific way. And because of that, he is in this material world. And in the spiritual world, where it is all pure, which is all pure, there is no struggle for existence. There is no question of being in delusion. There is no question of desiring or hating something in the spiritual world. One is above these dualities of desiring something and hating something, especially in connection with the Supreme Lord. One is always in the mode of subordination. And it is said here, Prabhupada further goes on to say, the senses are instruments for gratifying desire. Now the sum total body and instrument senses are offered by material nature, and as will be clear in the next verse, the living entity is blessed or damned with circumstances according to his past desire and activity. So Prabhupada is saying one is blessed or damned with circumstances according to his past desire and activity. So we have to recognize whatever situation we are in, there is some place of our past desire and activity, without which we would not have actually come into the material world. Sometimes we all blame different people, different circumstances for what we are. But at the root of all these things, if there was no desire or no hate, I would not have come into this material world at all. If I would not have come into the material world, I would not have faced any of these problems. So at the root of all this, somewhere I am responsible. I am actually fundamentally responsible. And therefore, that identity, that knowledge is very important. That if my desire becomes stronger and stronger to serve the spiritual master, to serve the Supreme Lord, and go back to the spiritual world, then that desire will protect me. That is the root solution that we need to come towards. But as we know, in the deluded condition, we all want to transform everyone else except our own self. And therefore we undergo different circumstances. And Prabhupada further goes on to say, according to one's desires and activities, material nature places one in various residential quarters. So Prabhupada goes on to further says that either be it a demigod or a hog or a dog, so based upon one's past activities and desire, one is given different kinds of bodies. So based upon that body which one receives, one is bound by the laws of nature to act in a certain way. One cannot overcome the laws of material nature. A dog cannot act like a human being. A hog cannot act like another animal. One is forced by the laws of material nature. And as we saw even in today's morning class, this verse Utkramantam, so this knowledge of how am I transmigrating this body is, people do not know. Why am I put into this body? Why am I enjoying something, or why am I suffering in this material body? What is this actually happening? So one is always deluded, and one does not know the real knowledge behind this. And that can be only known through Gnana Chakshusa, one who has got the vision of knowledge, one who has got the vision of the scriptures, or Gnana Chakshusa. So it is important that one comes into knowledge. Otherwise, one will continue not knowing these laws of material nature, acting in certain ways, and being given different residential quarters, Prabhupada is explaining, and therefore the living entity is suffering. So Prabhupada further says that this change of residential quarters is because of the attachment, the material attachment the living entity has got. Because of the covering with the material energy, the living entity develops different kinds of material attachment. So we can also carefully analyze how there are different attachments. Just like I was talking to someone in the afternoon, and they were saying, oh, I have responsibility towards my child, I have a responsibility towards my work, I have responsibilities towards so many things. So when I have so many responsibilities, how can I take the spiritual responsibility? So in this way, there are different attachments that come about, and one forgets one's prime duty. And in this process of developing different attachments, one loses one's life. This change of dress is due to his attachment to material existence. As long as he is captivated by the false manifestation, he has to continue transmigrating from one body to another. Due to his desire to lord it over material nature, he is put into such undesirable circumstances. So this attachment that one has got has to be transferred to attachment towards a pure devotee of the Lord. So this is another very important principle. The material attachment, everyone wants to gain something materially, but that has to be dovetailed, and that has to be engaged in the service of a pure devotee. It is by that one becomes purified. It is also important that how does one obtain knowledge by which one can overcome these dualities or attachments. It is not possible by associating with another person who is also filled with dualities or materially attached. It is, as we see in Bhagavad Gita, Prabhupada says, the best example is that of Arjuna. He could not understand, he was deluded whether to fight or whether not to fight, whether the material attachment of killing his own relatives, he was not sure whether that is the right thing or the wrong thing. And therefore, he took shelter of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And Hare Krishna. Yeah. So Prabhupada says that just as Arjuna heard the signs of God from Krishna himself, similarly, if the living entity submits to this hearing process from a pure devotee of the Lord or from the Lord himself, then Prabhupada says the living entity will lose his long cherished desire to dominate over material nature. So Prabhupada is saying why sometimes we always hear again and again why hearing is so important. Because it is by this hearing, Prabhupada says, that the living entity will give up or lose his long cherished desire to dominate material nature. Otherwise, this tendency to dominate our material nature does not go away. And it requires, because we have been conditioned for so many years, deluded by so many lifetimes, that this is the right way to live life, that is by dominating material nature. But this tendency can only go away, Prabhupada is saying, by hearing a pure devotee of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And gradually and proportionately, as he reduces his long desire to dominate, he comes to enjoy spiritual happiness. And Prabhupada is correlating. It's not only that one will start losing this material tendencies of controlling, lording over attachments, but also to the proportion one is hearing. To that proportion, one will also experience spiritual happiness. In a Vedic mantra, it is said that as he becomes learned in association with the Supreme Personality of Godhead, he proportionately relishes his eternal blissful life. So, it is very important point Prabhupada is bringing, that this impact or this effect of change in one's desiring, in the way one is desiring, comes about by hearing from the authoritative sources. And Prabhupada is saying that it is because of one's association with the modes of material nature that one comes into this delusion of thinking oneself to be this body, or his family and friends to be the real objects of affection, and so on and so forth. And unless one does not raise above the modes of material nature, one cannot overcome delusion. That's why, as we are also hearing in the morning, that one has to at least come to the mode of goodness. As we also see in Nectar of Instruction, the very beginning instructions Srila Rupa Goswami is giving, so that's to bring one to the platform of goodness. Because Srila Rupa Goswami says, when one comes to the platform of goodness, then everything else that needs to be done will become revealed. He will come to know. Otherwise, in the mode of passion and ignorance, it is very difficult for one to understand the science of God. One to understand this knowledge of Bhagavad Gita and understand this various aspects of how the laws of material nature are working, how my own desire, my own material attachment, I am transmigrating from one body to another. So, in this way, it is very important to see how our own desires and hate brings us into different circumstances. I'll maybe just quote one last verse. In the discussion between Maitreya and Vidura, there are various nice discussions, and one aspect of discussion comes about so there is a description about the life of Kardama Muni and how he gets married to Devahuti and how he leads his life. And even there this word of Ichha Dvesha comes, but there Maitreya Rishi is explaining as how Kardama Muni got freed from this Ichha Dvesha. So here it is said, Ichha Dvesha Vihinnena Sarvatra Samachetasa Bhagavad Bhakti Yuktena Prapta Bhagavati Katihi. So here it said, freed from all hatred and desire, Kardama Muni being equal to everyone because of discharging uncontaminated devotional service, ultimately attained the path back to Godhead. So, uncontaminated devotional service, that is the way forward. So, as we have been also looking at how offenses to the holy name, how different kinds of offenses prevent us from experiencing this freedom from hate and desire. But when we render uncontaminated, sincere devotional service, Prabhupada writes that, actually this verse says, one obtains Bhagavati Gatihi. And Prabhupada emphasizes on this word, saying that the destination one can reach. In fact, it was obtained, the destination was reached by Kardama Muni. So, this process that we have of devotional service, we have to do in an uncontaminated way. Uncontaminated way means to do as told by the authorities, by spiritual master, and with the right intent, free from different kinds of expectations, fruitive expectations, or speculative endeavors in devotional service. But simply by hearing and following the instructions and rendering uncontaminated devotional service, one can be very soon be freed from all hatred and desire, and by this one can reach the highest destination. I'll stop here and see if there are any questions or comments.
Hare Krishna Prabhu.
Hare Krishna.
Thank you for the wonderful class. So, Ichcha and the question is Ichcha and Dvesha. Is it synonymous to likes and dislikes, Prabhu? Because generally when we understand duality, it's like this. There is light, absence of light is darkness.
Mm-hmm.
There is heat, absence of heat is chillness. There is desire, absence of desire is desirelessness, but in this case, hate is mentioned. So, how to understand hate and desire? Is it actually the Lord is saying likes and dislikes?
So, as we see from Prabhupada's translation, so Prabhupada is translating as desire and hate. So, you are saying how this is duality?
Yes, Prabhu.
So, basically, mm-hmm. Yes, so desire is a positive connotation of wanting something, and not wanting something is like I hate it. So in that sense, they both fall in one place. So I desire in a positive sense something, at the same, or else I don't desire, that means I hate it. Why don't I desire it? Because I hate it. And therefore it is dual. So in one sense I want it, or in another sense I don't want it. So one is in material world prone to desire something or hate something. At the root of the desire and the hate is desire to come to the material world, lord over material nature, become like Krishna. Envy is why is Krishna having or hating the idea that Krishna is having everything and I'm not having everything. Why is that? So in that sense, this can be compared to be two opposite sides of.
Yes, Prabhu. And also in the purport, I think Prabhupada mentions that the desire is to be like Krishna, and the hate aspect is to envy Krishna. Now we know that many living entities, I mean in the modern world, they don't know Krishna, like the atheist. So how does the second aspect apply to them? Envying Krishna, like they don't know Krishna to envy Krishna. So like what is, I mean, but we know that that's why they're here. So how do we appreciate that second part in connection with the modern?
You mean to say how do they hate when they do not know Krishna?
Yes.
They hate, and that's why they do not know Krishna. Because the Lord in the heart, who is present in everyone's heart, who is giving remembrance and forgetfulness, it is because they hate. That's why the Lord, out of their own, respecting their own free will, is not giving them the remembrance. As we see, that's why Tesham Sadata Yuktanam Bhajatam Priti Purvakam Tadami Buddhi Yogam Tam. So that's why who gets that intelligence to know Krishna? Only one who renders Priti Purvakam, Bhajatam Priti Purvakam. So one who renders devotional service. So without rendering devotional service, if I do not engage my senses in the service of the Lord, why should Lord reveal his relationship. And because as we also see in Bhagavad Gita, that bhaktosi me sakha cheti. So a devotee, only that rahasyam can be understood only by someone who is a devotee. Otherwise, although this knowledge is present, he is blind to it. He cannot see it. Although it is visible, he cannot enter into that realm of what is the reality, what is that is actually there. So that internally there is an envy. That is the first reason why one is not able to know. And therefore, one may say one is not knowing, but that's also because of the hate or the envy one has got.
Thank you.
If there are no questions or comments, yes, Prabhu. Jai Prabhu.
Hare Krishna Prabhu,
Hare
thank you so much for the wonderful class. Very, very nice. My question is you said that ultimately we have to take fundamental responsibility for being in the material world and also our condition in the material world. And you said that it's due to our past desire and activity. And you also mentioned that it's also due to our attachments. So, and because of our attachments, we have to go round and round again in different residential quarters. I'm wondering, does the word attachment go under the umbrella of desire? So it's like the two main reasons that we're here are kama and karma, activity, desire and activity, and attachment is in this. Is attachment and desire like the same thing? That's what I'm trying to understand. Or are they separate entities that you're explaining?
I think they're similar, but perhaps the attachment is more stronger in the sense, desire can be slightly lighter. Desire is which can lead one to act. But attachment is something which is strongly fixated. So let me just quickly read out something. So, Prabhupada says attachment means accepting things for one's own sense gratification, and detachment is the absence of such sensual attachment. So, now the desire can be free from attachment, whereas attachment in this sense is very particularly referred to one's own sense gratification. Whereas the desire can be for accepting things of one's own sense gratification or for the pleasure or satisfying of the Lord. So in that sense, the desire can work in either ways, but attachment here has a very specific meaning of certain kind of sense gratification for one's own enjoyment. Does it help?
Thank you. Yeah. So does that mean that working with detachment would mean you're still working, but you're detached from the fruitive results of that?
Yes. So as we see, the opposite is absence, and in a positive sense is for the pleasure of the Lord. So real detachment means to work in the act for the pleasure of the proprietor and for the real enjoyer.
Okay, thank you so much, Prabhu. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, if there are no questions or comments, we'll stop here. Granthara Srimad Bhagavad Gita ki, Jagat Guru Srila Prabhupada ki, Nitai Gaur Premanande. Thank you for joining. Hare Krishna.